Okay, here we are. Welcome to the Media Roundtable Industry Edition, where we continue to bring you out of 5 million podcasts in the library. We have the worst music of all of them. We are working on it. We have professionals trying to fix this around the clock. I am here in what is still sunny Southern California in the Sherman Oaks World Headquarters of Oxford Road, where it's hot outside. And I don't know if I'm complaining or bragging about that because it's still January, but it is really, really hot. I went out in a sweater and it was too much. We are going to talk a lot about things that are relevant to people working in the business of audio here today, as we do every time on the Media Roundtable, with a special focus for the Chief Audio Officer, and that is the marketer who is tasked with making this thing work when we know it's very, very complicated. I was on a call last week and for something we're going to talk about later around brand safety, and looking at the stats on the industry and time spent listening, and just specifically in podcast, it appears that if you spent the same amount of money in advertising in podcasts, you being like the market, as every other channel gets based on the time that they get, we would probably be about an $11 billion industry right now. And James may check me on those stats later, but we just crossed the $2 billion mark. So we think so. Big opportunity out there. And why is it so hard for audio to grow and the podcast industry to get its fair share of the marketplace? Because it's hard to use and it's hard to understand. So we're going to break a lot of that down for you today. I am Dan Granger, CEO of Oxford Road, and I have some very special guests with me today. We have our most creative guy in the building at Oxford Road. I don't know, we're gonna have to come up with a nickname for Stu, but welcome Stu, who leads all of our creative efforts. Welcome to the Media Roundtable.
Thank you. And technically, Stu is a nickname. The full name is Stuart. So
I don't know if
may...
that flies.
Okay.
Is it when I say I'm Dan Granger, is that a nickname because I'm actually
We could do Studebaker. We can do I think we can workshop this.
The ad wizard is proposed by our producer Haley, and producer Haley does not know that Roy H. Williams is the Wizard of Ads, who is also an audio specialist. So I think that may be taken, but he is a wizard indeed.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
We also have Kristen Duenas. Welcome to the Media Roundtable. Welcome back to the Media Roundtable, Kristen. You've been with us many times. No stranger to the format here. I'm glad you're here to talk about it. Super Bowl's coming up, and you have been a part of many Oxford Road activities where we actually have done viewing parties at your house, grading Super Bowl ads based on our Audiolytics framework. How you feeling this afternoon?
Not terrible, not terrible. It's a good start to the new year, and it's been a while since I've been on, so thanks for having me back.
We're glad to have you back. Nothing personal about that. That was you must have been unavailable the 17 other times we did the casting call, but we're glad you're here now. And of course, the man from our global leader on this program, we have the great and powerful James Cridland, who, if you don't know, that you have not been paying attention to the podcast universe, because he is the editor of not only the Podcast Business Journal, but also Podnews. What's going on, James?
Dan, thank you. It's 84 Fahrenheit here today. So you talk about being hot, but 84 Fahrenheit and 92% humidity. Just walking outside is like having a shower. It's quite unpleasant.
What's it supposed to be like this time of year?
Well, I mean, it's supposed to be hot, but it's not necessarily supposed to be quite as humid and, full of floods as we currently are. I'm in Brisbane, Australia, by the way, for those who don't know. So, we've got lots of floods and everything else. It turns out that there's some kind of, climate catastrophe going on at the moment. Who knew?
Who knew? All right. Well, we're going to talk about some big stuff today. We're going to revisit some topics that may have come up before, but some new information has come to light that we will be sharing with you and all of its implications. There's been a big update in the world of brand safety and suitability. There is a shifting landscape in podcasts for who's actually listening. And there's also a question of, is podcast coming to the rescue of TV, its larger, older media cousin? So we're going to get down into some of these topics right now. First things first, I'm going to just share with you guys an article that came out saying that Amazon rides the year-end wave to overtake BetterHelp as the top spender on podcasts. So what does that mean to anybody? So there's been a lot of talk about brands overtaking performance marketers, because this started as like a pure DR channel with a lot of direct-to-consumer brands. Now, Amazon is a direct-to-consumer brand still, but I think we can all agree it's much, much more than that. When you're over $1 trillion in value, you're kind of something else. And whereas the top 10 spenders that were propping up the industry were a lot of like more VC-backed startup-y .coms, that's changing. That's changing very quickly. And so just as an example, now it goes Amazon, BetterHelp, Apple, followed by HelloFresh, much like the past. They dropped a fourth, but then you've got Toyota, State Farm, AT&T, T-Mobile, Discover. The place is looking a lot different right now. So what does this mean? What does this mean if you're on the media side? What does it mean if you're on the advertising side? If you're a brand, if you're the chief audio officer, one thing to think about is that as the larger brands come in with different metrics, they may be looking at a lot more upper funnel type of metrics, softer metrics, awareness metrics, or maybe they're not looking at metrics at all. But if you're a performance-driven brand, you're looking bottom of funnel, so you need to see conversions. What this means is that you have to pay attention to the fact that the whole ecosystem is organizing to make it more suitable for the large brands. And that means that they may be doing away with things that were important drivers for performance. And so when you're going into market and you're going to buy, if you're a buyer of awareness, it's, look, you may be getting taken to the cleaners and not know it, but you also may not feel it. It may not be as important to you as long as someone tells you you're getting the impressions. But if performance matters to the business, make sure somebody's expert and somebody knows their way around things like frequency capping. We've seen issues where a brand buys a 30-second spot not knowing that they could have had a 60 for the exact same price. There's a lot of nuance that you need to pay attention to. So make sure you're paying attention to the changes in the industry as it moves to accommodate these businesses. And the note, my point of view, and I'll open it up for some other thoughts, my note to publishers, which I know everybody wants the big brands. I know you want to kick out the DR guys as quick as you can. Makes sense. It's the way of the world. But, something radio figured out in its 100+ year history was that you kind of have to have different product offerings suiting different customer profiles. And what we haven't seen yet is publishers wake up to that and go, all right, look, for the D2C folks and for the people that are looking to measure their ROI up front, we're going to have some product offerings. This is where especially the live reads and the personal endorsements are so important. How do you price that and how do you structure that and create an on-ramp for advertisers who are focused on the KPIs that are going to require that type of nuance? How do you have a different type of offering for somebody that's more awareness driven? Because oftentimes what's important to one is going to be less important for the other. And we're getting big enough that this should not be a one size fits all universe. So that's my hot take for now. Anything you guys want to throw in on that?
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to Amazon, that's something they come up a lot because we look at and analyze the top advertisers in audio, and it's like, well, what are they advertising? What is Amazon's dollars being spent on? And it's interesting, the lion's share of it, like around $45 million, is advertising on audio for Audible and Amazon Music. And then they've got a pretty good chunk there for Whole Foods Market and Amazon Prime and Amazon Business. Like, they're all over the place. So just for the listeners and for my own curiosity, it's like, well, what does that mean when Amazon's spending money on podcast? That a big chunk of it is pushing people to their audio properties, and then it's a much smaller slice. So then you see them spending and pushing people to screens for Thursday Night Football or for Citadel. So just when I hear that, it's like Amazon's one of the top spenders. What I wonder is, oh, what are they spending it on? And it's interesting. They're in audio, pushing people to more audio, Amazon Music and Audible. And then they've got Whole Foods, and then they're pushing people to Amazon Prime Video to watch their specific programs.
So part of what I'm taking from your point is that it's not exactly a fair comparison, because when you're talking about Amazon, you're talking about like 72 different.
Yes.
Programs. And yet the part that is true is that it all rolls up to one company, and what that company wants is going to dictate how the industry behaves, right?
Exactly. They're throwing around a lot of money. Yeah, like you said, it's not apples to apples, but this is a big brand that sees the value here.
For sure. For sure. Well, and one of the things that I think the larger brands are looking for, I think most of the desire to move the industry deeper into programmatic is brands. And Kristen, tell us what the advancements this week are on the programmatic front, because it has significant impact on all of us.
It does. It does. And that was a really good segue. Well done, Dan.
Thank you.
So
I'm working on it.
advertisers really turning up the juice on programmatic buying. ComScore put out a survey on programmatic revealing that 62% of ad buyers plan to increase their year-over-year investment in programmatic. Not terribly surprising, all things considered. For the last, 4 years or so, 4 or 5 years, we've been talking about programmatic not being there. It's not ready in the podcast space. And really now we are starting to see just a plethora of our network partners making their inventory available programmatically. So now that the inventory and the reach is there, buyers will follow. So it stands to reason that we are going to see year over year increase in investment. Oxford Road is, well within the range of the numbers that are being talked about in the survey. So I expect that we will see our programmatic buys increase as well. And what they're saying is stable media budgets are anticipated, with connected TV budgets increasing to 17%, right? Taking share from linear TV budgets. So really holding flat TV, if you can compare linear TV and connected TV and kind of hold them in a TV bucket, one's taking from the other, but the budget's remaining flat, whereas audio and podcasts are really the only channels forecasted for budget share increase, rising from 7% to 8%. So really we're getting, more and more importance with that programmatic ad buying, especially with the younger audiences kind of being everywhere. It makes a lot of sense to buy programmatically, lower CPMs, higher reach, getting people where they're actually listening. So as, the shares are increasing for podcasts when it comes to programmatic buying, one thing we really want to take into consideration though, is it's never going to replace post-read ads for performance marketers. Right? We know that host-read ads outperform programmatic or run-of-network brand spots, in an apples to apples, one-to-one comparison. So I think there's room for both. I think we're going to have, space for that programmatic high reach intensity buying, but we also want to make sure that we're holding true to those host reads to get the true performance in.
Kristen, when you are looking at programmatic and you just figure, all right, I've got a host read on a show, and then I can buy it programmatically, what type of difference do you look for in CPM as a rule? I know it's going to depend on the show, it's going to depend on the publisher, but if you had to ballpark it, how much more valuable is one than the other?
I would have to say 4 to 1.
4 to 1. And
4 to 1 host read, yeah.
And for folks that are thinking, oh, programmatic, now it feels like digital, I'm just going to go in. Why, or what are the things that they may not know that are the pitfalls that keep a lot of people from going into that space or causes them to bounce out after they try it?
One thing, there's a couple of things, right? Obviously efficiency and rate structure needs to be there. It needs to be inexpensive, especially because you're trading, your host reads for a brand spot that's not going to have the same pull. It's not going to have, for a listener who's hearing their host talk about this product, they say, oh, okay, I this is what I want. This host I listen to believes in this, and I'm gonna buy the thing that they're telling me to buy. You're trading that for a brand spot that really sounds kind of more like a normal radio ad spot. It's definitely more skippable. So you're going to want to have true efficiency in that rate structure. And then on top of that, you have to take into consideration that not all networks are created equal as far as visibility goes. So knowing exactly what shows you're airing on, what formats you're airing on, which ones are performing best can help drive future strategy as far as like really integrating with host reads down the line. So I think you lose a lot of that with
So you feel
programmatic.
like the host read piece is the most significant. You don't think it's
do.
more about the execution, the limits of the tool, frequency?
I think it's great for super high reach, super low rates, and kind of like a shotgun approach to ad buying. I don't know that ultimately it's ever going to replace, what we know in performance marketing that works with host reads.
So I'm just going to use an analogy to do an endorsement for endorsements. If I went to the podcast movement evolutions conference in just a couple of months and nobody knew who I was and I wanted to meet a bunch of publishers, I'd have to walk up to all of them, introduce myself, hope that I came across well, hope they didn't know I was nervous, interrupt them, get through the awkward part, and then hopefully start to build a relationship if they'd make the time for me. But if I walked in shoulder to shoulder with the great James Cridland, and he said to people that are all flocking up to him, let me introduce you to somebody that I have known and trusted for a long time, because I think he can really help you. It's going to be a very different conversation that I have after that. Getting walked in by somebody that already has trust established in a field with people that already trust that individual, totally different, night and day. And I think that probably goes to the 4-to-1. But I know, James, you have some grumbles on this. So,
well, I mean, I only have grumbles in terms of lower rates, lower CPMs, and everything else. I think, you were talking, Dan, earlier about what the radio industry has done in the last 100 years. I think one of the things that the radio industry hasn't necessarily done is maintain its cost per thousand. We're seeing radio ads being sold for lower and lower money now than ever in comparison to, inflation and everything else. So I just, I was busy doing some work on a national radio station in the UK the other day, and they are running 8 minutes of ads an hour. That's all, 8 minutes of ads an hour, and they will be properly pricing those ads out. They won't be giving those away. So I worry from a creator point of view about lower cost per thousand. I see that being, of course, a massive benefit to brands, but I think from the business side, the last thing that we really want is podcasts, with 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 minutes of ads an hour.
Well, and I'm sorry to say this, and you and I have talked about this before, James. I think that's where it's going until people get a hold of themselves and realize you could run half as many ads. And if you open up the endorsements, you can charge twice as much money or 4 times as much money, and it'll still net out. So
what does the ad wizard say?
Yeah, so the fetishism with all of the AI tech, it's just a watch out creatively to go, if that's where everybody is going, that means there's space opening up over here. And a lot of times I hear the decisions that are being made, even creatively, aren't necessarily based on the audience or the message. It's to lessen the amount of work of a poor person that's already working 2 or 3 people's jobs, right? But driving that, having that drive the creative isn't the way to go. Audio is inherently intimate, and that how do we look at doing these host reads, and then how do we do things like incorporating the sounds that ads make, or even having them incorporate a sonic brand into a live read that is the antithesis of making something more efficient. It's incredibly inefficient because it's very custom. You have to work with each network and each host independently to go, hey, this is how we could do this, or what, what would be the roadblocks to be able to make that happen for you guys? That's the space that's exciting to me on the creative front, as everybody's running over to make everything. And Kristen, you were talking about it. The breaks are sounding a lot like invisible radio ad breaks, right? So how then shall we live as chief audio officers? Yes, there's a value to those things. We probably should have, we're doing something programmatic and do all that, but now go the other way. And how can you maximize the live read? How can you make sure that you're there getting that? And how can you make the live read even more interesting?
It's interesting because I guess when we talk about AI, and we're not going to stop talking about AI, it's really hard. And I think this is all industries and all businesses. It's really, really hard to know which solutions and things you're hearing and reading about are just people that were working on NFTs 18 months ago. And they just said, oh, there's a new wave we can ride. Let's package it up and, not really worry about the benefit. And then there's the parts that are really, really deeply meaningful. So, I think it's probably important as we're continuing to evolve this conversation that we really identify, where does it look like a parlor trick and where is it actually like moving the ball forward for users?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think, interesting to see what's going on here in Australia. There's an Australian first, which of course has to do with AI. Weirdly, Australians seem to spell AI with a small I. I don't fully understand that, but anyway, so this is an Acast thing with news.com.au, which is the big News Corp website here. A company called Creative Fix and a company called Audio Stack. So you've put all of those together, and what they're doing is they are producing automated AI-driven ads, which are essentially taking the latest real-time news headlines, advertising news.com.au. I actually have an ad here. Shall I play it?
Yes, please.
Here goes. Here goes. Oh, let me press this button.
Now, the latest news from news.com.au. Many Australian cities are bracing for their hottest days in years, including Western Sydney, where the temperature on Saturday is expected to soar into the mid-40s, as experts warn of dangerous conditions in some areas. For more on this story and the latest news, be on it at news.com.au.
I have to say, that's an AI voice. It sounds kind of okay. It doesn't sound fantastic, but it doesn't sound awful either. And I do wonder whether or not that opens up new categories of advertising. There are always supermarkets with special deals that want to promote something just for today only. News organizations, anyone else with timely information and stuff like that. It's not just an Acast thing. Anyone who uses a Avast tag could do this sort of dynamic ad placement. I've been playing around with dynamic audio for a number of years now. So you can program this with basically any podcast host. Of course, I'm not quite sure how it works with downloads, but I think certainly it's from my point of view, it's a valid tool to have in your toolbox, even if it isn't necessarily the tool that I would use all the time.
Yeah, so fascinating. I'm glad you played that thing. My off-the-cuff reactions are, number one, that type of news is now effectively worthless, in that anybody can get it anytime. Like, you used to pay a guy to fly over the freeways in a helicopter to talk about where the accidents were. And now no human can just, connect into Waze or whatever, and just... and I think if you're like on a 24/7 format with radio, that could be very valuable. But if I have a podcast and I'm trying to distinguish the value I bring with every word spoken, I can't see that that's a highly valuable resource. It's a cost savings. If you're doing it anyway, sure. But like, as soon as you do it, you've basically acknowledged that you're not bringing anything to the table that is defensible in any way. I don't know.
Yeah, I guess I walk past a lot of electronic billboards for the local papers, which are all run by Murdoch here, as is news.com.au. and you see the latest news headline up on the billboard,
Yeah.
trying to associate that particular brand, the Courier Mail here, with the latest news, which I guess is, it's something to do. It's something that actually works from a brand positioning point of view. But I do wonder whether there are tools that you can use like that aren't necessarily as obvious, but ways of pulling in AI voices to update something. Stu, I don't know whether you have a point of view on this.
I mean, there are tons of tools out there to be able to do this very thing, and partners that we have that we work with. I think the thing that I think of the most is that we say AI voices, they're clone voices. And it's like, this is a photograph, right? We know this isn't the person. This is a photograph of the person
That
that's
Bono?
being used. Yes, this is Bono.
Okay.
And the rest of them. And so it's a clone of a human voice that like actually performed a bunch of words or sounds. And I don't know, I just feel like that's important. And I don't even know if clone voice is the right word, but even the way that we talk about it, I think can kind of put some people off when you go, I mean, it's a human performer that you are just programming the words in. I think the most important part about this deal, and we're just seeing stuff like with the George Carlin thing, is disclose. Like, listen, if it is an update on the news, I remember driving through Kansas as a kid and they had the farm updates and it was some robot voice back in the 80s, the moisture level for Wichita is, like that has its use. That's valid. Can we make that sound more human and agreeable? And nobody's thinking I'm being misled here. It's like, I need to know what the rain's going to be so I can do what I need to do. It's information only. The danger zone to me is it the host saying this thing? Did the host even sign off on this advertisement? Like that's where my mind goes when I'm thinking about these clone voices. And then the other piece of it as well, as we're using them day in and day out, is that it's like a photograph of a person. It's like stock photography, but it's stock performance of just of the sound. It's just so hard for us to wrap our minds around it because we're so visual.
Well, what I like about the use case is that it shows how fast we're getting there. And, we went really deep into connected voice in 2019, 5 years ago. And it was too early. I think, we got we did some interesting work as a result of it. Kristen, you were deeply involved in our smart speaker focus, right?
Yes.
And it wasn't that it wasn't valuable. It was just a very small market because they haven't figured out how to use tech or didn't have the tech at the time to unlock what's actually possible here. And where I think this is endlessly fascinating and immensely powerful, that's in the short term, I think now, is that you can say, okay, I don't have 3 hours to listen to a Joe Rogan interview. Give me the 26-minute left, the 26-minute version, because that's how long I have till I reach my destination, and focus on the topics that are most interesting to me and have it repurpose that, right? Like that's when this stuff starts getting cool, when voice commands can get content, a block of content, stretched, and you can laser in on things that are particularly interesting, and it'll actually match with the time that you have available. So I like that we're going in this direction. I like that it's coming faster. But, unfortunately, it seems like it just means a lot of people that have had a job that made sense for a long time, that job's no longer going to be available, and they're going to have to find a new way to apply their talents. And that's, scary and hard, and also good in other areas as well.
And let's not forget that Arnold Schwarzenegger has a podcast that is entirely AI. So that is a thing that already exists, and his own children can't tell the difference. So if we can clone Arnold Schwarzenegger's very, very distinctive accent to where it's unrecognizable. I mean, really, what is that opening up for most of podcast advertising? We're talking potential turnaround times on creative and airing AI voices from the hosts that would be much faster than waiting for, recording days and, 1 week, 2 week lead times. I think the future of AI is interesting and we're right on top of it.
Yeah.
And it's the Terminator. I'm probably
It's a little bit.
It's like
Was it even the governor or was that a
yeah,
robot that,
yeah. This is
a lot of questions that come out of that.
It is Skynet. We are already there.
But I do,
it all started with a podcast.
And Stu said this over, and I don't think we can say it enough until it gets done. We need rules for disclosure. It's fine as long as you tell them. And I don't think we have that yet. So, the fact that what you just shared about Arnold, that may be news to people who knew that he had a podcast, which means we're not clear enough in our disclosures. I don't know. Do you think that'll happen?
I guess I would push back on that a little bit and just say, why would we need disclosure on that news.com.au ad? I mean, that it doesn't matter if it's an AI voice or not. If it's a clone of Joe Rogan and Joe Rogan is saying, hey, it's going to be hot in Sydney today, well, that's a different conversation. But I think if it's just a random voice appearing from nowhere, giving an update on, on the weather and then going away again, that's probably okay, right?
I think so. That's where my head's at, is that it's like, I think of like stock imagery, all the brochures or whatever you've seen for different, any advertisement where it's like they're not recognizable, so they're somewhat completely exchangeable, and in fact now you can get the AI to make a photorealistic thing of that. Anyway, that's a whole other dimension, but the point is what you're saying, James. Yes, that is how I am thinking of it, is there's a whole tier of stuff that probably doesn't need a disclosure, though it may end up having one, with how litigious things could be over here in the States, where it's like, this is a clone voice, but maybe not. But definitely with the
in
host,
front of a live studio audience.
Yes. But with the host, I think that's coming, and it's gonna come on the other side of. I mean, this George Carlin thing is actually really good.
Yeah, you want to explain what that is since you've introduced it, Stu?
Yeah, so the Dudesy podcast put out a episode, George Carlin, I'm Glad I'm Dead, that allegedly was trained on decades of George Carlin's material and performed as George Carlin with a clone of George Carlin, and they're being sued by George Carlin's estate by going, hey, you're using copyrighted material. We didn't sanction this. That is not George Carlin. These are the kinds of things that I think we're going to see a few more, like, let's say, car accidents without seatbelts that are going to finally push us to have to put seatbelts in the cars to go, okay, when it comes to a recognizable talent that has a known audience, when it comes to those kind of shows, you've got to disclose.
Yeah, but in that particular case, they did, I mean, the first thing that you heard was somebody else's voice saying, this is, built by AI, which, by the way, was a lie because it wasn't. But this is built by AI, and what you're about to hear is not real. But I don't think that necessarily absolves them from blame. And I think what the court case is all about is obviously using his voice, using his likeness, and it's George Carlin's estate who's taken that to court. I think it's going to be fascinating watching.
Well, what I would say is that once you have rules of the road with how to do a disclosure, yes, they said that disclosure goes in one ear out the other. It's a Wild West. So Dudesy can say, well, I disclosed. Well, there isn't a rule about disclosing that. So this will create the infrastructure. Things like this is going to create the infrastructure to go, what is the exact phrasing going to be that then you are absolved, because there are no rules yet to go, that's good enough, you're absolved. Now, once it finally goes before a judge, maybe a judge is going to go, yeah, they disclose whatever. But that's where we're at now, is that there are no rules yet.
All right, so tell me if you've ever heard of any of these companies. Indeed, Shopify, NetSuite, Headspace, Quip, Theragun, Postmates. I'm not only the host of the Media Roundtable, but also CEO of a company called Oxford Road, and we are the world's leading independently owned and operated audio ad agency. And what that means is that we help great companies, many that you have probably heard of on some of the other podcasts that you listen to. We help them test and scale campaigns in audio channels, with podcast being one of those leading channels. Some of the work that we do includes media planning and buying, as well as analytics, attribution, and insights. And we also have a very special way that we deal with creative and copy generation. We have our own proprietary process called Audiolytics that allows us to score ads for their persuasiveness. If you're looking to be involved in audio and you want a partner that can help work with you to make sure that you achieve unprecedented ROI and massive scale, you should get in touch with us at Oxford Road. And by the way, the only reason that we're able to do the work of the Media Roundtable is because we have a great team at Oxford Road that supports us and makes it possible. So, what we're doing is not just a podcast, but we're really trying to help brands live out their values and balance that with their business objectives, which is an increasingly hard thing to do in this world of misinformation and malice that's infecting so much of our media. But at Oxford Road, we don't want to just broker this stuff. We want to impact the industry for good. We want to raise the bar on what gets created. And Oxford Road is helping make that possible through the Media Roundtable. So if you're somebody that's interested in working with an ad agency or a partner on this type of work for your advertising campaigns, go to oxfordroad.com. It's easy to spell. And get in touch with us, or at least just sign up for our free newsletter, The Influencer. That's oxfordroad.com. Right. And okay, so going back to James's point about you think they should disclose intellectual property, estates, things like that. That's a separate issue. That's going to get worked out. And I think that sounds pretty intuitive that that'll happen. I think, James, you're agreeing that if there's a personality associated, we should disclaim. But if it's just a general newscaster that's AI driven, you're saying you don't think it should. And Stu's agreeing with you, but I'm still on the fence. And the reason I'm on the fence is because as I'm thinking about it, it's like, okay, if I'm a person and I'm reading you the news, I have something to lose if I say something that's incorrect. The machine doesn't have anything to lose if it's incorrect. You don't know if there's a malfunction in that machine. You don't know if somebody hacked it. But it's not a person who actually is, even if they're not disclosing who they are, somebody had to do the thing. So I could see the argument. I don't necessarily disagree, but I'm not totally settled on the idea that, robots don't have to self-identify. I don't know.
Yeah, I think the difference probably is who has written these words. The words for that news.com.au ad were written by a human being. It's just an RSS feed. So the fact that it was an AI voice, I don't think needs to be disclosed. If the words were also written by AI, I think that's a different conversation. And I think all of a sudden it gets really hard. And one of the problems that I now have is, I'm getting an awful lot of press releases every single day. A lot of those press releases are now very clearly bulked up by AI. And a really good giveaway is when the image is also an AI image as well, which you can spot from a mile off. I'm trying really hard to point out when AI is being used, but some of the press releases and things that I'm getting, I frankly haven't the faintest idea whether or not it's AI or not.
Yeah, and it sounds like you do know, and it is funny. It's like you're so spot on about like the phrasing and the imagery, like it has a whole look and feel. I mean, another story to talk about, an interesting use of AI, I think, is AI generated imagery for advertisements within a video podcast. So there's this new company, Rim Brand, that's a startup that's backed by UTA. And just to use a very specific example, on the podcast Asian Boss Girl, they did an ad for L'Oreal where and you can see this story in Bloomberg by Ashley Carmen. It's AI generated virtual products are coming to a podcast near you. So you can see this image, but you see these three hosts sitting here. So it's a still image of the video podcast, and there's a Fructus poster on the wall behind them. Well, it wasn't there when they filmed. So Rembrandt goes and can find spots in the frame that it can use, and what one of the key people over at Rembrandt was talking about is like, it's so handy with podcasts as video because it's a locked off shot. Like anybody that's even dabbled in any kind of video editing software, you can grab a corner and you can pin something up there. But as soon as the camera starts moving, it gets a little bit more difficult. So it's a locked off shot. They can put up the image there. And then when the podcast itself, the creators are making their show, let's say they do 3 or 4 episodes at once, like Asian Boss Girl does, they don't have to have that's where you are taking some inefficiency out. That is true inefficiency, where they don't have to have, well, we got to ship you the poster and then put it up in the back and then take it down halfway through and da. That can all be done in a digital environment. I think this is a really fascinating one. And they also mentioned in this story an example that had been done in audio, and this was a couple of years back, where they used a cloned voice, where they've got sound effects, and it's a Johnny Walker advertisement in Q code, where you hear one of the producers say, "You're listening to Listening In, presented by Johnny Walker blended Scotch whiskey," and that's something that you could change out with AI as well. So whether it's on the audio front or what's really exciting here in the video front, that to me is a use of the AI technology that's really cool, because that would be like, you would have to send them the poster. They would have to put it on the wall. You don't have to do all of that. You can put it up for the allotted time and even change it out for a different advertiser when it's time to put up a different poster.
But does that need rules?
Whether or not that thing is there, that's a good question. I struggle with all of this because, like, there's that piece of me that's like, the whole thing is illusion, So
Yeah.
what's the damage of what really is that? I think that's our big struggle from the digital to the analog, and with NFTs, like, what is real? And it's like, okay, look, how does it play out? They went over there physically, and a production assistant taped up a Fructus poster for 15 minutes, and then they walked back over and tore it down for the rest of the episode, or we put that in later in post. What difference does that make?
Well, I think it makes a difference when I say, oh, the refreshing taste of this Diet Coke, and I'm actually drinking water.
Well, that's a different animal. I mean, I'm talking about this poster. I mean, yeah, that's misrepresenting, and no, you don't want to be doing that.
Yeah.
I mean, on the other side, rules on do we say that this is AI or not doesn't necessarily change whether or not we should be doing this with AI at all. We only have to ask Taylor Swift whether or not AI can be used for certain things, and she would have a view that just saying this isn't a real photograph, this is made by AI, is not necessarily going to cut the mustard in terms of that. So, there's a whole new learning, I think, where we need to understand what is right and what is wrong in terms of how to use all of this new technology.
I mean, what do you think of it, Kristen, from on a media front? Like, that opens up the entire viewing field of the video. I think of Ready Player One, where like the main villain, he's like, we're going to be able to sell the entire visual field up to 80% before it starts, before it induces a coma. Like, do you see this going disastrously wrong, where all of a sudden I'm watching a video podcast and there's 68 posters behind them?
Not necessarily anytime soon. I read the article about Rembrandt, and the way that they've portrayed it is that all of the brands were personally vetted by the hosts. So it's nothing that doesn't align with the podcast brand, right? So there is a certain amount of brand safety in that vetting process. Will everybody have the same set of ethics?
No.
Maybe not. Probably not. I mean, we're human.
Most assuredly not.
Most assuredly not. Right. It's a video, so it's not necessarily it's not necessarily using the host's likeness in order to advertise. It's a backdrop behind the host, as if they were standing in Times Square and catching an ad behind them. If that's how Rembrandt remains operational, I don't see there being an issue. I think the issue would be if it was the voice
what
and
happens
likeness
when
of the host.
Yeah, what happens when Alex Jones and his production company get a hold of this technology and he's telling you about the moon rock on his desk? And the audience doesn't actually know where it came from. So I think it's good. By the way, good to call out Rembrandt. What is it?
Rembrandt.
Good to call out Rembrandt for their ethics and their ethical approach. That's positive. But I would say beware, because I think there's going to be a lot of negative use cases that come out of all of these changes, and we got to pay attention and try to head them off at the pass so it doesn't do catastrophic damage to the industry.
When I like James channeling Malcolm from Jurassic Park with you were so busy asking yourself if you could do something, you never ask yourself if you should.
Yes.
That's gonna stick with me. That's gonna stick with me because I'm
Yeah.
presented with these stuff all the time, and I can get very caught up in just like, oh, we can do it, let's do it, like let's try that, and it's like, wait a minute, let's slow down. Like, what? How does this really play out?
And I think, there was a Facebook video shared only a couple of weeks ago. Some big brand who had faked up a ad for themselves on the Sydney Harbour Bridge. So they'd faked up the fact that they had done an advertising wrap on the Sydney Harbour Bridge. They hadn't. But what was interesting, and it was a very smart video that looked very cool. But what was interesting is in the comments, lots of people really upset that what they consider to be a national, monument in many ways had been desecrated by advertising. And the amount of negative comments in there, and the amount of how dare this big brash American company, because I'm sure it was, how dare they come in and ruin our holy Sydney Harbour Bridge. So I think we have to be, really careful, in terms of that. But tons of really interesting things that you can do with video, and it turns out as well that video is really popular when paired with audio. There's some new research which has come out from a company called Hub Entertainment Research, revealing that podcasting can drive samples of TV shows. So apparently 16 to 34, 50% of those listen to a TV series related podcast. So one of those watch again podcasts, or one of those accompaniment podcasts. Tons of data about that. One of the other figures that came out was that 50% of 16 to 74-year-olds who listen to any podcasts say that they will be more interested in watching a TV show based on a favorite podcast. So there's some real crosswork going on, in terms of TV networks and podcasting. Who knew podcast advertising works?
Yeah, well, I was going to say. Well, first of all, James just
that's your T-shirt.
Who knew? James just took the prize for smoothest transition in this podcast so far, and he actually got us out of the AI quagmire. We're never going to leave.
Oh, you got us back in.
It sounds like he has a full day of work ahead of him. But no, very compelling. Yeah, I mean, I think we kind of talked about this earlier. Like, there's a difference when a host introduces a product to their audience, and it's all about word of mouth. It's an actual organized recommendation and referral at scale. So, I think the question I would have is, does that mean podcast works really well for TV, or does that mean podcast works really well? And I would probably go with the latter, although TV as an entertainment product from an entertainment medium, you already have some good overlap there. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, what I think is so cool about this is like we've seen so many comics got turned into movies because they had that IP that they had tested, and it's already all built out. What's so cool about podcast is it's with audio is that you're listening, you're creating these worlds in your mind, just like a book. Like when they take a book and they finally make it into a movie or into a television program, it's just cool to see that dynamic at play, and it makes so much sense. And it'll probably mean even more stories going into podcasts because the producers are able to go, oh, this is interesting. I can't test it with a comic book. We kind of did that. We've done that. It feels like we're at the tail end of that, but we can pay a few people to get behind some microphones, do this story, see if we got a sign of life. That crowd's already bought in. They're going to show up, and then we can build off of it. That's exciting. I think that's very exciting.
I'm curious what Kristen thinks, but the one thing I would just mention here is that actually podcasting could be a way for the TV networks to help maintain interest in shows while they're in between seasons. And that's one of the things that this podcasting research said, that actually, you know, virtually everybody agrees that if you're listening to a podcast about, you know, The Bachelor or America's Got Talent or whatever it might be, that actually during seasons, it just keeps you warm to that show, you know, and everything else. Do you listen to TV shows, TV podcasts
I
at all?
don't listen to TV shows, but I will say that over the last several years, I've noticed an increase in the celebrity interview shows where now celebrity guests it's just part of their press junket. It's part of their press tour for any new TV show in between season. Hey, I've got this new season coming up, a movie coming out. And I've found, I'm one of the statistics. I've found different shows that I wouldn't have considered watching, except I heard this guest on Smartless or Armchair Expert and said, oh, this is really interesting. And I'm actively engaged in listening. It's entertaining. It doesn't feel like the hard sell of, oh, go watch this, right? It doesn't feel like the trailer on TV, like in the middle of a break. It feels more organic. And then I remember it after and say, oh, that's right. So-and-so was just on that show and that sounded really cool. I should go check that out on Netflix. So, you know, that there's more than one way in which podcasts are helping drive television viewership.
Indeed. Well, and it's become the new whistle stop tour for presidential candidates when we used to have presidential candidates. You guys remember when there was a primary?
Oh, what is primary?
There
Have
used
you-
to be
have
a
you
big
guys got an
question mark
election
on who
going
the
on?
front runners were going to be. What's that?
I can't believe. Have you guys got an election going on or something this year?
Something
I've
like
not
that.
heard anything
No,
about
there's
it.
an election. There's an election, but it's the primaries we don't do anymore. Anyway, so James, I know you had a story, something about brand safety, I guess. I'm unfamiliar with the subject.
You're unfamiliar with the subject. You're quoted in the press release, Dan Granger. Yes, so this is a company called Seekr, which is an artificial intelligence company. They announced the release last week of Seekr Align, which is nothing to do with teeth. That's the first thing that I thought of when I saw the brand. But no, it's an advanced brand safety and suitability tool. What I think is quite interesting about this is that there are lots and lots of podcast episodes out there where no one knows whether they're brand safe, whether they're brand suitable. There is a big, big, big long tail. And what Seekr Align, my understanding of it is that it will help brands and ad agencies understand all of those hundreds of thousands of podcast episodes, which they should be advertising alongside. So I think that this is good for the industry. You're actually quoted in this, Dan, so I'm guessing that you know rather more about it than I do.
I forgot all about it. Okay, thanks for jogging my memory. Yes, we have a strategic partnership with Seekr, and you know, where we've been heavily involved is that, you know, everybody's trying to make sense of GARM, and it's not the first platform to give you GARM scores that give you no, low, medium, or high risk scores associated with podcasts based on their transcripts and the machine learning that interprets them. That part is not new. But what is new is that I think this is a level up in terms of the actual usability, because one of the things that happens if you've ever gone into these platforms and you go, okay, let's see what they did with millions of minutes rated. you actually go into it, you see, oh, I noticed that Cridland's show has low civility and high instances of violence. And so when you go, well, how did that happen? That's not the James Cridland I know. And so you go and you click in and you see what episodes over indexed, and it's like, oh, this is a show that was high risk of violence. And then you go, okay, I'm going to click into that, and you go and you actually see the text that flagged it. Well, if you do that, what you find is a preponderance of bad examples where the tech failed. And most of the end users who are starting to pipe this into programmatic and make decisions have no idea of the volume and concentration of false negatives first. And there's also false positives. But then, as great as technology is, it has limitations. The team at Seekr is fantastic. We've had partnerships with at least 3 of these groups. So my biases are coming out of my nose. But what I will say is, one of the really exciting things is you can actually go in as a publisher and flag where you feel you've been misrepresented by the system, and it immediately goes to their team to course correct the way the machine is reading those statements. And so what I think is happening is very quickly you're getting not only a brand safety analytics tool, but you're actually getting one that you can believe the results. And that's very, very powerful stuff. The second thing, and we've talked about this in the past, is the civility score is the hero metric on this. And that is something that we've been involved with since the name civility score, since the idea of civility score, because what it does is it takes the question away from the nouns and moves it more to the adjectives or the statements of about people. And instead of just saying, okay, well, because there were these violent words, because James is always using the word shot in his podcast. And even though he's talking about the basketball game, they think he's talking about shooting people. Well, instead of just focusing on that, civility score says, okay, well, how are the points being made? Is it being done with personal attacks? Because I think one of the big problems we have, at least in this country, is that people are making their points by dividing people and exploiting differences. And they do it by labeling other individuals in the way that they make their points. And most of this stuff doesn't need to be personal. And so part of the strategy behind this and part of the future vision is that we have an open podcast ecosystem where maybe anybody can be platformed, but not everybody gets rewarded for bad behavior, because it's going to be known if the way that you make your points is by taking somebody else down in the process. Stu, did you have anything on this?
I think that's fabulous. That is the well, no, really it is. That's the real question. And I think like the real world example wasn't it was Office Ladies. They're always talking about shoots on their show. And they were identified as oh, this is violent, right? And it's like, oh, that's interesting, shooting. I think my thought is kind of more global, and it goes back to just AI rules of the road. Is like, who's minding the shop? Like, in a similar experience, we did some AI creative testing with some folks, and it was good, and you could kind of zoom in on a couple of things that was like awesome. But if we really dug in and looked at it, there was these outliers where like a top rated ad and a bottom rated ad, they were identical, but you had to look a couple levels down. And then that kind of makes the whole thing, you go, what are we even really measuring here? But what I love about all this brand safety and suitability stuff, I guess it's 2 thoughts. One is, if you are using any kind of these AI tools, still there needs to be somebody with their brain engaged that cares about the result, that is minding the store. That's one. And then 2, I think it's not just good for these tools, it's good for us as people and as professionals. It's like, that's really the metric, is the personal attacks, right? We need to be able to talk about any ideas, but that gets me excited about it, to go like, oh, wow, we can change the reward structure based on that. That would be fantastic. And it makes sense.
Well, and a lot of this is a passion project for us, but there is a commercial viability. And so part of the story is that we believe that if the podcast industry is to meet the stated projections of going from 2 to 4 billion in 24 months, this is the type of thing that is required to help us get there. Because right now there's a lot of blind faith, a lot of assumptions, and a lot of fear that push people out of sponsoring the channel. And we think by making it a safer, easier to identify content that aligns with your values environment, we're going to see a net positive. So final story, I would say let's go to Kristen, and some about podcasts getting cool again. What's happening there?
I dislike the
Did
word
it stop being
again.
cool?
I feel like podcasts were never not cool. Arguably, podcasts have been cool forever. It's just taken people a minute to catch on. Podcasts have shifted from niche to mainstream, and you've got a lot of diverse creators attracting younger audiences. YouTube's really stepped into the game now, where it's the largest listener base, which makes a ton of sense. More and more traditional podcasters are now realizing, oh yeah, I should be on the YouTube, and are pulling a different audience there. So I think, podcast still cool. The article that we're referencing here was a blog post, really. It was more of like a love letter to podcasts. They called out Gen Z and millennials making out the majority of weekly podcast listeners, and said that boomers had to catch on. And you know what I noticed there is Gen X was completely overlooked again. We often are, which I dislike tremendously. But elusively, Gen Z and millennials are making up the majority of weekly podcast listeners. Boomers still haven't caught on, and Gen X is just quietly here listening to podcasts like we always were, always thinking they were cool. So get rid of the again. Podcast still cool.
Podcasts have been cool. I had lunch with somebody today who works in the industry, and they were talking about how it's losing its shine and all that. And I'm like, well, what changed? Did we go from 5 million to 4 million podcasts? Are there not enough good ones, or did the good ones go away? But it's I don't know. It feels like the hype cycle on podcast got so intense that it's the business is great, audience, time, revenue, all of it's growing, but it's oh, but you're not as buzzy as you were, so you're not on as many listicles talking about podcasts, so therefore it's losing its edge. And I'm like, come on,
Right.
this is nonsense. But I always hate the trend. Sorry, James.
I kind of think it's podcast was cool as an up and comer, and now podcast is more grown up. And turned out that cool kid turned out to be a cool adult too. And so it's
oh, yeah.
And I think the news hype cycle is just big. I mean, I can just think of some lunches I've had where it's it's just those headlines get glommed onto. It's hey man, so this podcast dead? How's it going over there? You guys, it's what? Just because we found out that you can't just throw any celebrity into a podcast. My takeaway on it is just that I feel like podcasts are all grown up. They're growing up. They're now a young adult. They're in college, and they still are. They're still pretty cool. They're just not maybe as they're not going and lighting stuff on fire with their friends like they used to be when they were in junior high.
They're grown,
and I think also firstly there are more podcasts out there, and so therefore it's less likely to have that serial moment of everybody listening to the same show. But I think also on the other side, we have been seeing an awful lot of negative stories recently. A great positive story this week in that SiriusXM signing that multi-year agreement with Smartless, pulling it away from Amazon's Wondery, a deal worth $100 million over the next 3 years, apparently. So it's those sorts of stories, I think, that will get people excited about podcasting as a thing again. And I think that we'll see, more excitement as those types of stories happen, and as some of the work that we're seeing in the buy space actually helps podcasting, who knows, maybe double in value for next year.
Well, and I particularly like that Smartless story because one of the predictions I made, and was only one of a couple for 2024, was that spend on content was going to go up. So we need to see a few more of those deals coming through.
Yes.
So that prediction can be true.
So we'll thank Jason Bateman for making podcasts cool again in the minds
Yeah.
of people that haven't been watching all the stats. And I think that's it. I think that's all we got time for today, guys, because I think James is going to hang up on us if we go into another story. But any closing thoughts, closing arguments? No? Okay, then Stu, for those listeners who can't get enough of this quality programming, we have another podcast that we produce out of Oxford Road, and you're also the wizard behind that curtain. So can you tell us a little bit about Ad Infinitum?
Absolutely. Yeah. Ad Infinitum is Oxford Road's audio creative focus podcast where we listen to and break down the top spenders in audio, and it's right in the Media Roundtable feed. You can also, there's also a separate feed for Ad Infinitum, but you get it if you're listening to the Media Roundtable. And you can just start at episode 1 to get a better understanding of what makes audio ads work and how they can work better. And like I said, we break down the top spenders in each episode, and we've had some awesome guests so far. Amanda DeMarco from Veritonic, Dallas Taylor, who's the host of 20,000 Hertz, and Richard Schotten, the author of The Choice Factory. So please listen to Ad Infinitum if you want to understand how real ads, real current ads that are spending the most in audio, what they sound like, how they're working, and how they can work better.
That was beautiful, Stu. You're crazy
Thank
if
you.
you're not listening to Ad Infinitum. Well, podcasts are still cool and audio is awesome. I want to thank you, James, Kristen, and Stu, for joining me today on the Media Roundtable. This podcast is brought to you by Oxford Road, where we want you to succeed in audio and also use it for good, as we've been explaining. If you're a marketer, you're a chief audio officer, you should check us out, oxfordroad.com. Subscribe to the weekly newsletter, The Influencer. It's very influential. By the way, I just want to flag James Cridland used AI in the middle of this podcast and actually got it to summarize the whole episode, which may or may not be the recap that we post alongside it. If you have feedback for us, email it to us, and our robots will inform us of what's essential from your note. info@mediaroundtable.com. Thank you to Bianca, Kyle, Haley, Scott, Mary Jane, Everett, the team at Podcast One, and as always, influence responsibly.
That was a banger, guys.